Guatemala is located in Central America, bordering the North Pacific Ocean, with a population of 16.34 million, covering an area of 108,889 square kilometers. There is a vast majority of the population that resides in the southern region of the country. The official language is Spanish. Guatemala is a predominantly poor country that struggles in the area of health and development in several areas. Guatemala is the most populous country in Central America with the highest fertility rate. 35% of the population is in the age range of 0 to 14. Another high range is 33.5% coming from the age of 25 to 54. Their political system is a democratic republic divided into 22 departments with 3 branches. As compared to the United States, they too have a president, James Ernesto Morales Cabrera. They have a few major parties with the Grand National Alliance holding office as of today. The political stability of Guatemala is significantly weaker than the United States, but as compared to the United States, they have no major dips or risings in the ranking as seen in the chart. Comparing to the United States, Guatemala has a much weaker rule of law system, with the US being ranked 18th while Guatemala is 97th. But they are trying to improve their rule of law since their civil war. Guatemala is a partly free country. Because of their increased influence of organized crime and business interest in campaign funding and also murders of the municipal office candidates. Their freedom ranking is now 4 out of 7. As of now, Guatemala is in a repressed state as compared to the United States, who is mostly free. Guatemala is on the rise to a more free state as of their latest report.
We're going to talk a little bit about doing business in Guatemala. The first part that we're going to look at is called the Economic Freedom Score. What this means is the degree of liberty that individuals have in a country to pursue their own economic interests. As you can see from the last 4 years of data, Guatemala has been consistently in the low 60s, whereas the United States has been in the mid 70s, comparing the scores. This is a good thing for business because it means that there has been some consistency with people there and how they're spending their money. The next graph that we will look at is called the FDI, Net Inflow and Outflow. What FDI stands for is Foreign Direct Investment, and this means that a particular country is establishing or acquiring business to and from other foreign countries. As you can see, the United States in 2015 had an inflow of $379 billion and an outflow of $348 billion, whereas Guatemala in 2015 had an inflow of $1.1 billion, whereas an outflow of $31 million. That's quite an improvement compared to 1995, when Guatemala had an outflow of negative $19 million and an inflow of just $75 million. The next graph that we're going to look at is called the GNI per capita, and this stands for Gross National Income. Basically what this is the country's income divided by its population. It's indicative of the average income for all of its citizens. As you can see in the graph, the United States, for the last 5 years, is around the $50,000 range, whereas the world is around the $10,000 range per year. The high income is labeled around $40,000 a year, and Guatemala is particularly low below the world average at just $3,000 per year. Moving on, we're going to be looking at the Human Development Index chart. What does the Human Development Index mean? Well, it's a bunch of factors rolled into one, and it covers such things as life expectancy, education, per capita income, things like that. As you can tell by the chart, the US is ranked number 8 in the world, with a ranging score from 0.82 to 0.91, ranging all the way back from 1980 until 2014. Guatemala, on the other hand, is ranked number 128 in the world, and it has a ranging score of 0.44 all the way up to 0.62. This is roughly 35 years of data looking at how these developing countries are incorporating all these factors together. We also have an inflation chart. Inflation is basically the rising cost to buy goods or commodities in both countries. As you can tell, both have consistently moved together over the last 20 years. Also, notice the spike around the 2008 year and then a decrease around 2009. Both countries are fairly represented by the chart from 2005 to 2015. In correlation with the inflation chart, now we're going to look at the unemployment rate percentage. Look closely at the United States. It seemed to be more affected by the global recession in 2009 than Guatemala. They topped out around 9.6%, falling slowly thereafter. However, on average, they were between a 5 and 6% unemployment rate. Guatemala, on the other hand, has stayed low around the 3% mark and didn't see quite the increase that the United States did in the 2008-2009 period.
The next slide shows the Human Development Index for Guatemala and compares that to the U.S. rankings. So the Human Development Index is a measure of the quality of human life within a country. It measures takes in consideration such things as educational attainment, life expectancy, and whether average income is enough to cover the basic needs of the citizens within the country. So, can they afford such things such as food, shelter, and health care? So it's measured on a scale from 0 to 1, with countries scoring less than 0.5, having a low amount of human development or more poor quality of life, and those over 0.8 is considered a more high quality of life. So Guatemala ranks 128, and this is out of the 188 countries that were measured. And so in 2014, they have an HDI score of 0.627. So this puts them in more of the moderate range on the scale for human development. They did have a steady increase in their HDI scores from 1980 through 2010, which shows the country is making some progress. But when you compare it to the U.S. at an HDI of 0.915, they still fall pretty short. For Guatemalan culture, they do have a mix of ethnicity, so they have a large population of Mestino and Europeans, and still a very significant amount of the indigenous Mayan tribal population, which still makes up about 40% of the remaining population. Their language is a mix of Spanish and Amerindian, and their religion is heavily weighted towards Roman Catholics, but they still have some Protestant and some other indigenous, Mayan beliefs. For Hofstede's dimensions, this is a graph that shows a comparison between Guatemala and the U.S. again, in each of the measures. And there was a few measures that they really didn't have anything to show for Guatemala. So if you look at power distance, Guatemala is much higher than the U.S., meaning their less powerful people believe that power is distributed unequally, and that hierarchy is very clearly established. If you look at their individualism score, it's very low, and this means that they have a high level of collectivism. They have a moderate level of masculinity. They have a high level of uncertainty avoidance, which means they have a strong need for rules and regulation, and are less likely to take risks and more resistant to change. And since there was really no measure for long-term orientation or indulgence, I decided to still include it in here. But pretty much because I can predict that Guatemala would likely score lower in comparison with the U.S. in both long-term orientation and indulgence. So moving on to education, current state of the education system in Guatemala is substandard, to say the least. As you can see in the table, Guatemala falls short in every measured category compared with the U.S. And these are measurements taken off the Human Development Index. They have a high student-to-teacher ratio, which 25 students per teacher compared to 14 per teacher in the U.S. They have a much lower amount of public funding. As you can see, only 2.8% of GDP. So the few teachers that they do have, they don't have the proper tools or teaching materials that they need. Very few advance to secondary education, only 26% compared to the U.S. 95%. This is due to high dropout rate, especially in rural and indigenous populations of Guatemala. And then with more than half of the population living below the poverty line, the children are forced to drop out of school. They drop out to help support their families, and sometimes they just simply can't afford the basic, school supplies, books, uniforms, or transportation to and from school.
These next few graphs, we're going to take a look at how science and technology is advancing in Guatemala. The first way we can measure this is through patent applications. Unfortunately, Guatemala hasn't had very many. They've only averaged in the hundreds over the past 19 years, compared to the United States, where they've had hundreds of thousands each year submitted to the patent office. The amount of patent applications can indicate the amount of innovation going on in a country, and they are also a great way to help us study the technological changes happening in Guatemala. Related to this is R&D expenditure, or research and development expenditure. This is measured as a percentage of the amount of GDP going towards R&D. While patent applications help us study the technological changes, the R&D expenditure is an actual key indicator of how government is trying to obtain the competitive advantage in the field of science and technology. R&D is measured by three main activities. The first is basic research, second, applied research, and the third is experimental development. As you can see here by the graph, Guatemala is far below the U.S. as far as research and development goes. It's down at about 0.05 instead of where the U.S. is hovering right around the 2.5 mark, a little above. This next graph is focusing on environmental factors. The EPI is what measures this, or the Environmental Performance Index. This is a 0 to 100 scale, and it tells you how close you are to actually reaching your goal. The U.S. right now is right at about 60%, right above it, and while Guatemala is at about 30%, so a little bit lower there. The EPI uses 9 different indicators to measure how you are doing. It measures health impacts, air quality, water sanitation, water resources, agriculture, forests, fisheries, biodiversity and habitat, climate, and energy. And as you can see there in the graph, you want a lower score because it's ranking you on this one. Obviously, you'd rather have a score of 1 because that means you're number 1. Guatemala competes with some of them, but is a little bit behind the United States. They are currently ranked 88 out of 180 out of 180 countries, and the U.S. is 26th. This next graph shows Guatemala's overall IPRI, or International Property Rights Index. The overall index is a combination of 3 subcategories. The first, legal and political, environmental, which measures judicial independence, rule of law, political stability, and control of corruption. As you can see, Guatemala is at about half of where the U.S. is. U.S. is about 7.3 right now, while Guatemala hovers around 3.4. The second subcategory is physical property rights, which is a combination of protection of physical property, registering property, and the abilities for the country's citizens to have access to loans in order to purchase property. So this category, Guatemala actually is competitive with the U.S. It's only about 1 behind, and they're doing really well in that area. The third and final subcategory is intellectual property rights, which includes the protection of intellectual property rights and patent protection and copyright protection. Again, these numbers are about half of where the U.S. is currently, but the numbers are steadily increasing. It's a 1 to 10 scale. Right now, Guatemala is at 4.5 and the U.S. is at 8.6.
SWOT stands for Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats. For our designated country, which is Guatemala, one of the strengths is proximity to the United States and Mexico. Guatemala also has a free trade agreement with the United States, which helps them reduce trade barriers, import quotas, and tariffs. It helps increase trade, and it's beneficial for both countries. Another one of the benefits, the strengths that Guatemala has as a country is moderate debt ratios and economic balance. It has access to international financial support if needed. They could reach out to other countries, United States, Mexico, if need be. Potential tourism and natural resource excavation. I know my father, for example, visited Guatemala 15-20 years ago, and he said it was one of the greater trips he ever went to down there. One of the weaknesses of the country that we're going to go into is poverty, high separation of class. It's one of those deals within the country that if there's there's a whole bunch of poor people, but if there's people with money, there's a lot of it as well. Another one of the weaknesses is high dependency on the U.S. trade and commodities that we were talking about earlier. And another weakness that Guatemala has is high drug trafficking and crime rates. Another weakness they have is political instability, low military power, low military world ranking. Let's go into the opportunities section of SWOT. One of the opportunities that Guatemala has is developing human capital, proper implementation of natural resources, citizen access to the legal system. And one of the more interesting parts that I had read up on is that nearly all tariffs with the United States, agriculturally, all the tariffs will be nearly eliminated by 2020. 88% of Guatemala's soil is actually fertile, so it's big on agriculture. Another one of the opportunities that they have is to progress in healthcare development because it's very poor right now. One of the threats that Guatemala has is deforestation. We'll go back to those mines, mining down there. You got to be careful that you don't overdo it. There's a lot of natural resources down there that you have to preserve as well. which goes into our next threat, is exploitation of the natural resources. Another one of the threats that Guatemala faces is climate change, leading to poor land management strategies for agriculture. So even though they have that 88% fertile soil, they have to be very careful to preserve it and take the proper precautions going forward. One of the larger threats that Guatemala faces regularly is judicial and political corruption. So they have to watch out with that too. Make sure that they get things going on the forefront and take care of proper, objective, high-standing people to get into office there.